All right. So the recording has started. It will be available. All of the CSC winter PD recordings will be posted on the CSC website at the same time, which will be after Anthony McLean's keynote on, I was going to say August 17th, March 18th is his keynote. So after that, we'll compile them all and post them on the CSC website. But if there's one in particular that you would like to access before we post them all, you can email me and I can give you a link to the Dropbox where we store them temporarily before we post them on the CSC site via YouTube. So welcome. I would like to just take this opportunity to, again, remind everybody that we're recording and welcome you and hope that you're in the middle of a good week so far. And I think that some of you have your kind of a academic upgrading March break next week. Others don't, but if you do, I hope that it is a little bit of a downtime for you. I am, again, just checking the participants list here and everybody is muted, so that's great. Do please make sure that you're muted. And if at any time you'd like to add a comment or question, I'll do my best, as always, to keep an eye on the chat. You're welcome to unmute and jump in. There are a couple of places where I'll pause and formally ask for questions, but you don't necessarily have to hold your questions until then. So as always, I'm going to share my screen and get started here. So this is part 2. Last time, 2 weeks ago or so, we had a look at some of the background around the OALCF and how it came to be and what LBS used to look like some years ago. And that was important to set a bit of context. I recognize that not everybody needed or wanted to attend the first session. If you did attend the first session, you might see just a couple of points, a couple of slides that are similar to some that you saw in the first session. I do want to make sure we have, we're kind of starting from a little bit of a level playing field of understanding today. And I'm just adjusting my Zoom screen here. So I will also trying something a little bit different with my screens. I usually have my presentation on my small screen and my Zoom meeting on my big screen, but I've reversed that today and hoping that that still works out well. So quick thumbs up. You can see the first slide on the opening screen. Great. All right. Briefly, a couple of things. Jump in or in the chat. What are you hoping you get out of today? That's before I tell you what we have planned for today. So, Allison from St. Lawrence, reminder about how it all fits together. I hope that happens today, Allison. Any tidbits I didn't already know, Shelley? Yes, I do hope you get some tidbits. Some more about connections. And again, I'm just reading out of the chat here. A recap of the OALCF, sharing about how we are using the framework with our students, better understanding of how everything connects. Yeah, I think the connecting piece is important. Some info on how progress is measured in CAMS. Yep, we do have that at the end. Some information on the progress measure. Melanie is hoping to learn a lot because she's new. That's wonderful, Melanie. I hope you do. And I would just like to say that best case scenario, this presentation or workshop would probably be about a half a day in person where we had some opportunities to break into small groups and do some more detailed sharing around some of our OALCF questions and methods and so on. I've cut things back a fair bit to fit into an hour. And of course, we don't really have a lot of opportunity to interact. We're not going to use breakout rooms today because there just probably isn't really time in an hour to delve that deeply. But I do want to encourage you to post your questions and so on as we go through. Oops. So a little bit of a preview. We're going to do a 5-minute recap of part 1, maybe not even 5 minutes. We're going to spend a bit of time because this question comes up a lot as to how, like, what is the fit of the of ACE into the OALCF? And believe it or not, back in 2012, the ministry made some comments around that. We're going to talk a little bit about mapping curricula to the OALCF, why we do it and how we do it. That was a request from a number of people in terms of today's session to talk about how we can do that mapping. Might be old hat to some of you, might be newer to some of you. Then we'll get into the second half talking a little bit about the performance measures in LBS, but specifically the one or two that are really tying into the OALCF. And the biggest one, of course, is the students' completion of milestones. So quick recap, I'll go through this pretty fast. Remember that LBS is a program and a funding source provided by, not from the Ministry of Training Colleges and Universities anymore, but from the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development. Always important to remember that we don't have a prescribed curriculum in LBS. College community-based school board programs use all kinds of different curricula in delivering what their learners need for LBS. We are required, though, as it states in the third bullet, to use the OALCF for reporting purposes and to promote learner mobility. From, say, you make a community-based program makes a referral from their program to yours. So that's what we mean by learner mobility across LBS programs. What is it not? Remember, it's not a curriculum. It's a very high-level overarching set of competencies. And the competencies are broken down into task groups and indicators of performance. There is no content in the OALCF specifically, but again, just broad indicators. There's no learning outcomes. That's our job as educators, to provide the learning outcomes within our courses. You can map, I will say almost many curricula can be mapped to the OALCF with greater or lesser success. And certainly, as it says in the last bullet here, the pre-ACE and ACE curricula we use, and by pre-ACE, I just mean anything that you use to prepare students for ACE level learning, that can be mapped to the OALCF. Some of you have done that quite deliberately over the years at your colleges, others a bit less so, but it can be done. In the same way, if you were delivering GED prep, you could map the objectives or expectations or outcomes of your GED prep back to the OALCF. If you're a community-based agency and you're delivering a customer service mini course, you could map those learning outcomes back to the OALCF. So the mapping exercise is an important thing to get our heads around. And again, just keeping an eye on the chat. Don't see anything new in there just yet. And to get sort of close out our recap from part one, the ministry, no matter what its name was and where the pot of funding has come from, the ministry has always recognized the importance of what we do in colleges to get our AU students ready for post-secondary and apprenticeship, largely using ACE curriculum to do that. So the second bullet's important. We have always used and we continue to use LBS funding to deliver free ACE courses. But always remember that the ACE curriculum doesn't belong to LBS because there is no curriculum attached to LBS. We have the funding from LBS that we use to deliver whatever curriculum we choose. In colleges, largely we choose to deliver pre-ACE and ACE curriculum. And you may or may not be aware, some colleges also have fee payer ACE courses available. Not as many as there were in the past, but there are some. And bottom line, the ACE program itself is a program that sits with the colleges. By comparison, the OSSD curriculum is a curriculum that sits with the Ministry of Education and the K-12 system. So the ACE curriculum is ours in the college sector. So we're going to take just a bit of a time warp here and remind ourselves of why in the first place that the ministry decided to go down the OALCF road. And that started way back in 2007. And by 2010-11, they had some documentation formulated around it as a result of a number of advisory and working groups that were working on the project at the time. But their really two main goals that they had back at the time were to, well, as you can read right here, to improve the transition of adults through EO and the broader education and training system by developing an adult literacy curriculum framework that would do two basic things: standardize the learning of clients across the LBS system and make services, LBS services and client outcomes more transparent for referring EO partners. We could spend many minutes, hours debating whether or not that's actually happened, but that was the original intent. You'll see I used this slide last time because I just wanted to make the point last time that when the OALCF was implemented, a lot of things happened at the same time. Sort of within a year or so, the OALCF documentation was launched, training occurred, we were brought into EOIS CAMS, and we also had a whole new set of measures on which we were starting to be measured in LBS based on our performance. And all of those three linked together quite directly, as most of you know. Okay, I see a new message in the chat here. I'm just going to pause and take a look at it. Judy, yes. Judy said from Confed says she's having flashbacks to that year. Yeah, if you were around and working in LBS at the time, it was a very, very challenging year, 18 months, 2 years. So we're 10 years down the road now, but it was very challenging at the time. All right, just moving along here. Hang on, go back to my other screen. So this is kind of where we're starting today, and it's partially where we left off last time. What's the OALCF? And you'd recognize this slide from part 1. Curriculum framework, not a curriculum. No learning outcomes or content. 6 general competencies that apply not just to education, but that apply to being competent as an adult in work, learning, or life. The tasks and indicators are described at 3 levels of increasing complexity. There are little subgroups called task groups within each competency and level. And there's indicators of performance within the task groups and levels. And I say again, we can map any curriculum to the OALCF to a greater or lesser degree. This is the OALCF in a one-page summary. And this document, came out back in 2012, and most of you, many of you, some of you may still have it printed out. You might still have it on your desktop, but this is another flashback if you haven't looked at it recently. Because this is pretty tiny and jam-packed into one page, I'm actually going to carve it out into the separate competencies when we start to talk about mapping. But that's it in a nutshell. So 6 competencies: find and use information, communicate ideas and information, understand and use numbers, use digital technology, manage learning, and engage with others. So going back to my comment a few minutes ago, these are competencies that apply not just to education, but to work and to general life. And that was the idea behind the ministry's impetus to create this, that it was a broad overarching framework, given that the learners in LBS have very broad overarching goals that are very diverse across the 5 goal paths. So the ministry was trying to capture many different kinds of competency and learning that could take place within LBS without prescribing a curriculum. So each of the large competencies are broken down into smaller task groups, as you can see, and except for the last 3, and I keep leaning over because the corner of my screen isn't visible, so that's why I'm leaning like this. I have to lean over to see the bottom left corner of the big screen. So digital technology, manage learning, and engage with others don't have task groups. But the indicators are described under 3 increasingly complex levels. Pause here again, just check the chat. Any questions so far? And I think I want to just digress for 1 second and say once again that there's a lot of content. Like, this is a pretty word heavy presentation. And if we were doing it in person and we had a bit more time, or even if we had a couple of hours or 3 hours to come on and off Zoom and go back and talk about things and do small group work, it wouldn't be quite so text heavy. But in this particular Cole's Notes version, it is pretty text heavy. So recognizing that there's a fair bit of reading in this today. I asked this last time, but I'm going to ask it again, because people who are new to the OALCF who attended last time may or may not have different likes, dislikes, pain points, things that they find useful. So again, just jump in the chat with, let's talk about pain points first. What do you struggle with? Or what do you find confusing? Or what do you not like about it? Anything like that. Shelley says finding meaningful milestones, they are out of date. Yeah. Numeracy milestones are very rigid. Yeah, that's a comment from Leah. Difficult to have students complete them routinely. Yeah. Out of date for sure. Yeah, some agreement on that. Yes, they are. Milestones and company tasks are just extra work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead, Therese. Oh, Therese, I thought you wanted to jump in there. Can be hard to integrate an assignment. Judy agrees with Tina. Okay, no problem, Therese. Yeah, so lots of general agreement around some of these things that everyone's saying. Students don't really get why we have to do these sometimes. That's right. For those milestones that aren't built into our curriculum. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, lots of agreement around the challenges with milestones. And of course, milestones is the big piece of the OALCF that does relate to our performance measures. And because we are academic institutions and we deliver content and skills through learning outcomes in courses, you know, that's a very prescribed and tried and true method of what we do. And it's true that the milestones aren't really a good fit into that framework, you know, to use framework in a different context. Originally, the ministry said that they would develop more than 60 of the milestones, but as we know, nothing has happened new in the OALCF since it was released back in 2012-13. The only thing new that happened was that originally there were 6 culminating tasks, and in 2013 they added another 12 so that there were 3 for each goal path. And that's really the only new thing. A few of the milestones were reinvented for, especially for the deaf stream students who needed ASL interpretation, or for very low level students who needed to do the milestones verbally. But the milestones they weren't new milestones. They were just ones where the instructions were modified a little bit to make it easier for either ASL interpretation or for verbal delivery of the milestones. Okay, I'm going to go out there on a limb and say, is there anything you find useful about the OALCF? Okay, so Megan comments that it's organized and that the information is fairly readily available. It is an organized framework. That's true. I agree, Megan. Broad application to be creative in programming. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Shelley, because that really was, I think, one of the ministry's goals, as I said before, is to try and capture the very broad range of things of competencies that LBS learners may attain across all the sectors and streams. Allison says it encourages to think about how to build skills sequentially. Lee mentions the progression is clear. Yeah, I think those are all valid comments. When we look, I'm just going to go back to the when you kind of look at that little chart in a nutshell, a number of the comments that you're making do resonate. So let's start talking a little bit now about ACE and the fit into OALCF. And the reason that I stressed both in the first session and the second session the concept that there isn't a prescribed curriculum in LBS and that we use LBS funding to deliver ACE is to try and articulate that ACE is not outside of LBS as content that we wish to use. It's owned and managed by the colleges. ACE is a college certificate, but we can use LBS funding to deliver ACE. We don't have to distinguish ACE within LBS. It's just one of many curricula that's used. And that's, I would say, was one of the original misunderstandings, is that ACE was apart from and separate from LBS, but it's actually not, because we can map the because we can map the ACE outcomes to the OALCF. Therefore, it falls within LBS, in which there is no curriculum. Way back in that first year or so of OALCF implementation, the ministry did provide some Q&A documents, and there was a number of questions in those Q&As around ACE, because they had collected some questions both from the support organizations like the CSC, questions from individual service providers, and tried to produce some some information, as they often do in Q&As when a new concept or a new requirement is unfolding. So even though nothing new has come out, those Q&As are actually still posted on the OALCF website. And I mentioned last week, it's located on the eopg.ca site, which is the Employment Ontario site where they store a lot of their information. So if you went to eopg.ca and you went to programs and services here, there would be a link to LBS, which would take you to this page. And then down here, there's a link to the OALCF. So this is just a screenshot. It's not a live shot, but that's where the documentation is still stored. And I mentioned that at the first session as well. So back in the day, there was some training provided when the OALCF rolled out, and there was ministry prescribed training, but each of the sectors and streams in LBS, College, Community School Board, Anglophone, Francophone, Indigenous, and Deaf, everyone was able to conduct their own training, provided their own trainers, but everybody used the ministry prescribed training documents at the time. And those of you that participated in the rollout of CAMS at the time would have almost simultaneously participated in CAMS training if that was part of your job as well. So the CSE conducted follow-up workshops to try and help address and answer some of these questions. But I'm going to apologize for the amount of text in the next few slides, but I think it's important to understand and see the context of ACE fitting into the OALCF and how the ministry described it way back in 2012. So sit back and take a sip of your drink, and I'm going to read out a few things on these next slides. And again, I'm watching the chat if you'd like to enter a question. So this is from a January 2012 Q&A. The LBS program is not curriculum-based. MTCU, because remember at the time it was MTCU, doesn't prescribe curriculum, but depends, and I love this statement, depends on the professional judgment of service providers. So I sometimes feel like our ETCs don't trust our professional judgment. And I hearken back to some of these early statements from the ministry that recognize our ability and professional judgment, not just in the colleges, but through other LBS providers as well. To provide learner-centered programming. Learners are assessed to determine gaps in knowledge. Programming is tailored to provide what they're specifically missing to achieve their goals. ACE is the contents delivered by colleges as learners prepare for post-secondary, apprenticeship, or some employment goals. The ACE certificate, issued by the colleges, is what some learners want to earn while in post-secondary preparation programming, aka in LBS. Neither ACE courses nor an ACE certificate is a goal path, just as the GED and the OSSD are not goal paths. The goal paths capture the broad purposes, again, very broad purposes for why an adult would come to the LBS program. It's the service provider who determines together with the learner what the specific content, might be ACE courses, and the mode of delivery will be based on the person's prior learning, available time, and needs. Then this was from a separate question on the same Q&A, and it was around what if a student's only taking one ACE course? And how does that fit in? So often a student is only taking one ACE course at the college, already has a secondary school diploma or equivalency. Well, many of our students do already have their high school diploma. That's true, not all. Having a credential, however, is not always a guarantee that all required competency, skills, and knowledge are present. Since LBS is not a credentialing body, and that's very important, having the student do milestones and a culminating task along with their learning activities, the ACE coursework in this example is the learning activities, is not a college-determined requirement for his or her transition to post-secondary. So it was important for the colleges to see this came out in writing, the recognition that milestones and culminating tasks have no bearing on a student's ability to move into post-secondary. The performance indicators for goal completion, therefore, are not a requirement for the college registrar for transition. No, they're not. No registrar is ever going to ask what milestones the student did or did they do a culminating task. However, there are requirements for the funded organization to demonstrate accountability to the ministry. That's why we have to do them. Not because they're a great fit most of the time, but in the broader LBS program, they are part of our accountability. And then in February, they came out with a second FAQ. So I got a couple of screens from the second FAQs. They reiterated a few things because some of the questions were a bit similar. And again, this is just an excerpt. The FAQs are much longer. The ministry doesn't prescribe curriculum, but requires that all LBS service providers prepare the learner with the competencies, skills, and knowledge for achieving a required credential, meeting the entry expectations of an external institution or employer, or gaining other learning requirements for successful transition to their goals. So this is still what we do. For the purposes of matching learner need with OALCF goal paths, service providers may use content that is not explicitly found in the OALCF and may use assessment methods that are not task-based. Well, because the OALCF doesn't contain content, this is an important statement. I also find it a bit confounding though, because the OALCF isn't about content. So saying that we can use content that's not explicitly found in the OALCF is, I think, a bit misleading because there's no content in the OALCF. It's about competency. And then they go on with an ACE example. For example, ACE biology and physics are not found in the curriculum framework because these are subjects of academic skill development which don't apply to all goal paths. That's right. However, they are learning activities that may be required to transition to post-secondary education. That's also right. Here we go again, professional judgment and a recognition of it. The service provider must use their professional judgment to include the content and methods of delivery and assessment that suit the needs of the learner to achieve the requirements of their goal. And that's what we do. Last screen from this little set of Q&As. ACE courses are compatible with the OALCF competencies, levels, and approach. Although more skill-oriented, ACE courses include all 6 OALCF competencies, and ACE courses require a learner to perform academic tasks at a level 3 complexity. Some ACE outcomes are actually probably an OALCF 2. Some are a little bit beyond OALCF 3, but they're certainly, they can fit into the framework. Oh, and that's what the next sentence says. Some tasks may be at a higher or a lower complexity level. The skills that learners develop through ACE courses will be tracked by the service provider, but not reported to the ministry. We report them through our colleges because we have our courses, we have students attached to courses, we assign grades. That's where the accountability for ACE lies, is within our own colleges. We're not accountable to the ministry for ACE delivery. We're accountable to the ministry for reporting based on the OALCF competencies and task groups and the completion of goal-related learning activities. Milestones and culminating tasks that are aligned to the curriculum framework will be provided to service providers in 2012, used to indicate progress in performing tasks that relate to the 5 goal paths. Milestone and culminating task results will be reported to the ministry, as will completion of the goal path and required learning activities. So I hadn't looked at those for quite a while, those Q&A documents, but it was a little bit refreshing to remember that the ministry had articulated those thoughts about ACE way back then. Stop there again. Comments, questions? Are you surprised? Is this old news to you? Any thoughts before we move on to the next piece? And you're welcome to unmute and jump in if you'd like to say something out loud.
Hi, Barb, it's Shelley.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi. My only question comment, I guess, is about the more recent change where they said that we can no longer do initial assessments based on digital literacy only. And yet they did recognize that, you know, the ACE computer course could be curriculum that we map to. So it's just an interesting disconnect that, you know, you can't assess them, but we recognize that the curriculum could align to that.
Yeah. So what Shelley's referring to is that in the eligibility guidelines for LBS were changed this year to say that students have to assess, and we actually address this a bit later in the workshop, students coming in have to assess below the end of OALCF 3 in one of those first 3 competencies. And I'm going to go back here for 1 second. So in the past, if a student could assess it before the end of level 3, for example, in digital technology, and they would be eligible. But now they can only assess, they have to assess before the lower than the end of level 3 in one of these 3 competencies to be eligible. So that's the disconnect partly that Shelley's referring to. And it's interesting because that's a much more recent change, Shelley. You know, that only happened last year. But yeah, it is a disconnect. And Allison had a question in the chat about the first point on the slide doesn't mean that each ACE course has to include all 6 competencies. No, absolutely not. That's a good clarification, Allison. I'm just going to skip back over to here. And also in the chat, Tina is agreeing it's silly now that so much is digital. Yeah, I feel like the fact that we can't use digital skills assessment to bring students in for programming now is really contrary to what's going on in the world. And the huge need as a result of COVID and the pandemic for people to improve their digital skills. So yes, Tina, that's part of the disconnect as well. Any other reactions, questions, thoughts, just to that, around what we've discussed so far? Okay, let's carry on then. So we talked kind of about mapping curriculum in general. So why do we do it? Because we have to meet the ministry's requirements to pay the bills. It's not a requirement of our colleges. It's a requirement of the funder under the LBS agreement. And then here's what we just Shelley, your comment was so timely because this is what we're talking about. We also do it to articulate eligibility for LBS. So less than the end of OALCF 3 in one or more of the competencies, find and use information, communicate ideas and information, understand and use numbers. We also have to map the curriculum so that we can have a learner plan that speaks to the OALCF and create, indicates competencies or task groups that the student is working on. And then, of course, drilling down a bit more to select milestones that are somewhat appropriate, recognizing again that the milestones have limited validity and relevance. And then also to support referrals to and from other LBS providers so that there's a bit of a common language. Again, we could debate whether the common language of the OALCF actually does help to make smoother referrals or not. But that was one of the original intentions and one of the reasons why the ministry expects us to work with the OALCF as a construct. So Sarah has a question in the chat. Isn't it digital skills an easy assessment? Meant to say that isn't digital skills one of the 6 easy? Yes. Okay. So Sarah's question, yes, digital skills is one of the 6 easy assessments. One can't, if somebody just did the digital skills assessment, it wouldn't be justification to bring them into an LBS program, because doing the digital skills assessment alone wouldn't allow you to say that they are at the end of, less than the end of OALCF 3 in one of these main competencies. So Sarah, does that clarify? If not, feel free to jump in and verbalize your question so we can address it better. Sarah's good with that. Okay. Allison says, do easy levels match OALCF levels? The easy levels match the IELTS, International Adult Literacy Survey levels, and they, I'm going to say it the other way around. The OALCF levels loosely match the IELTS levels and therefore loosely match the easy levels. But easy is a tool that you can use for assessment that will pretty readily allow you to tell if somebody is landing near the end of or before the end of one or more of these competencies. So the easy answer, Allison, is yes. The OALCF levels 1, 2, and 3 articulate pretty closely to the easy levels 1, 2, and 3. Okay, Shelley, it looks like you want to say something because your square on my screen is lit up. But maybe it's just because there's background noise where you are. So if you did want to jump in with anything, Shelley, please go ahead.
Sorry, Barb, I was muted, so I'm not sure why that's showing that way.
Oh, okay.
And
well,
I didn't have
worry.
anything else I needed to say, so.
Okay.
But thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. All right, so let's jump back over here to the slides again. How are we doing for time? 3:40. Okay, we're gonna. So we're into almost halfway through, and we're a little over half time. So we'll try and pick up the pace a bit, but not at the expense of questions. So let's talk a little bit about how we map. And what we really do is we take course learning outcomes and we find the best fit match into the OALCF competencies, task groups, and indicators. We're going to look at some examples from a variety of ACE course learning outcomes. And I'm going to stop sharing this screen for a second because I need to share a different screen and then come back to this one after. Okay, and I'm going to go to full screen here. Okay, and I don't want to see all those. Okay. Bear with me here a sec. Okay, there we go. Sorry, I should have done that before I moved over here. Okay, so this was what I showed you earlier. And I said that when we talked about mapping, I was going to break it down into the individual competencies. So here's an example. This is find and use information. These numbers 1 to 10 are outcomes that I pulled from ACE course outlines. We don't all have identical ACE course outlines. We all, we all deliver ACE outcomes that align pretty closely to the original outcomes from 2004, but we don't word our outcomes exactly the same way. So you may recognize a couple of your college's outcomes in some of these examples. And I've just tried to provide a way to walk through a sort of a quick mapping exercise. Because again, if we were in in groups and in a room, we could divide up and have some chart paper and do these exercises a little more interactively. So here's find and use information. Here's the level 3 indicator. Read longer text to connect, evaluate, and integrate ideas and information. Here's some places where it could apply in ACE outcomes. And I've tried to color code a bit. Here's a CALM outcome. Apply various reading strategies to understand and evaluate written information and ideas from a variety of sources. So there's the evaluate word. And again, this isn't a one-to-one fit. Mapping is about taking our outcomes and finding the best fit within the framework. And my cat just jumped up here. I'll just see if I can encourage her to go behind the screen, not in front. No, she's going to decide to visit me here. So hang on. There. I think that whatever dropped to the floor might have scared her. That was my phone. Okay, so taking a look at number 4. Assess information, ideas, and issues within challenging informational texts. So that kind of connects to the term longer texts. We have the analyze word in this outcome. And analyze and integrate could fit. Thanks, Jess. I see you're leaving momentarily. That's fine. So then I tried to pull an example from A2, from interpret documents. Read and demonstrate an understanding of a variety of informational, literary, and graphic texts. And what A2.3 is describing is somewhat complex documents to connect, evaluate, and integrate. And then I took A3, extract info from films, broadcasts, and presentations. And you'll notice that that is not leveled. But here's a couple of outcomes. Oh, sorry, I haven't finished A2. I wanted to highlight something in A2. Here's 2 math outcomes, number 7 and 8, that can fit into find and use information, because one doesn't even have to argue the point that finding and using information is something we do in pretty well every discipline or academic subject. So 7 is communicating solutions using appropriate symbols, format, and mathematical symbols. Example, diagrams, formulas, tables, graphs, and written statements. Diagrams, formats, tables, and graphs, formulas, tables, and graphs are all examples of documents. Analyze graphs. A graph is a document of various functions, including linear, quadratic, and exponential functions. So this goes back to the comment earlier that in some form, ACE courses can be mapped to 1 or more OALCF competencies. A3, extract info from media, basically. Here's a few outcomes from ACE COM courses around media. Analyzing information from media sources, assess media sources, evaluate media works, which really fits into this notion of extracting info from films, broadcasts, and presentations. Let's take a minute and look at second competency, communicate ideas and information. I did the same thing. I just pulled a few outcomes and tried to put in some color coding. Let's talk about B1, interact with others. Use speaking skills and strategies to communicate with different audiences. That's part of interacting with others. Maintaining lengthier interactions with 1 or more persons. Write concise and effective prose. So now looking at B2. And I'm not going to highlight every single one of these outcomes, but if you were looking at this later, then hopefully the color matching would help you to remember what we were talking about here. So concise and effective prose could relate to explaining and describing information ideas, could also relate to presenting information, ideas, and opinions. And notice the kind of subtle difference there. It's that when we get to the level 3 descriptor, we're talking a little bit more about opinions, which is a different level of complexity. Pausing here, Shelley says, did the CSC evaluate the ACE curriculum as a whole when this was implemented, or was it just left to the individual colleges to do? We did a bit of both. We did training similar to this approach way back in 2012, but we didn't take the whole curriculum and do a complete mapping. And part of the reason we didn't was because colleges don't all have exactly the same wording in their outcomes. So it was more or less up to the colleges to undertake this exercise of mapping, but we did provide some training similar to this on how one could approach it. Okay, a couple other highlights from here. Number 7, synthesize key concepts of physics. Well, that's another example of presenting information, ideas, and opinions. Not opinions so much, but information and ideas. This is actually from the ACE distance physics course, because we do have a couple of assignments in physics that are written assignments. They're not numerical physics calculations. Then B3 is complete and create documents. So again, diagrams, formulas, tables, and graphs. Complete a variety of complex documents and forms accurately. And I'm sorry if the pink didn't show up too well. Select and use appropriate numeric symbols, graphical and linguistic modes to represent and communicate scientific concepts and experimental results. Well, could be an example of creating a more complex document. So again, it's not a perfect fit, but it's a general mapping. Moving along here. When the colleges first understand and use numbers, the first reaction was that it's really hard to fit ACE maths into this particular competency. But I would argue it's not impossible. So let's talk about math here for a minute. C1 is manage money. Almost all of you have some kind of business math and or budgeting applications in one or more of your math courses. Here's a couple of ACE business math outcomes. Understand various ways of earning money and look over at the indicator. Make multi-step calculations to compare cost options and prepare budgets. Apply the math of merchandising. It's another way of, another thing that could fit into comparing cost options. Perform operations and solve applications involving simple interest, compound interest, and personal financing. You could still argue that it fits under here in C1.3. Here's a physics example. And that I have to say, managing time might be one of the hardest ones for us to map to, because time doesn't come up in a whole lot of our math, but it comes up occasionally. And it certainly comes up in physics. We have physics problems that relate to distance, speed, time, and they are definitely multi-step calculations that involve time. C3, using measures, got all kinds of ACE math that uses measures. Solving geometry problems, solving trig problems, solving problems including geometry, measurement, and trig. Solve numerical physics problems. And when you look at the way some of these are worded, it's always about multi-step calculations. And that's where the articulation to ACE can happen a little more readily, because so much of what we do at ACE level, is multi-step when it comes to math and sciences. And then just briefly, managing data. There's also quite a few examples of managing data that we can map here. So these are outcomes from a little bit from core math, a little bit from apprenticeship math, and I think one from tech math. Collect, organize, and display and interpret data. What does it say up here? Integrate and analyze data. Again, I used this example earlier. Diagrams, formulas, tables, graphs, and written statements. Data collection, organization, and analysis, collecting and analyzing data. So you can fit a lot of ACE math, not all of it, but a good chunk of it into this kind of framework if you're trying to map it there. And then we'll just spend a few minutes on these last 3. Digital technology, again, doesn't have specific task groups. So I just pulled a few outcomes from a version or 2 of the ACE computer course. And I think it's fair to say that some of our ACE computer coursework is at level 2 and some of it's probably at level 3. And some ACE work is probably at level 4. But the point is that a good chunk of it can be mapped to level 3 in the OALCF. So simulated online capacity, produce correctly formatted documents, maybe some higher level skills, file management skills with storage and retrieval. And one could argue that doing some more complex file management is problem solving to perform multi-step digital tasks. Maybe not the best example, but an example. using electronic tools to collect information required for solving a specific problem. Again, that problem solving to perform multi-step digital tasks. That's probably one of the better fits in this example. Again, just checking the chat here. Formulate achievable. Okay, manage learning. These are right out of self-management. And I didn't do anything mapping to engage with others because that, in fact, could apply to lots of different courses, even in a virtual environment. So we have a few minutes left to spend on performance management. I will continue a little bit past 4. If you have to leave, I understand. And I apologize for maybe not getting the timing quite right on this one, since it is going to take a little bit longer than an hour. If you do have to leave and you want to access the recording, though, you'll be able to do that to finish up the last few minutes. So I'm going to stop showing this one. I'm going to go back to my other one here, back to the presentation. Okay. Okay, so we looked at some samples. Questions, comments? Okay. Now we'll spend a few minutes, as I said, on performance measures. I'm just laughing because I was reading back in the chat where Lee said a cat's work is never done. Absolutely, Lee. Yeah. Here's what we're measured on from the ministry, not from within our colleges. There's 3 dimensions, as they call them: customer service, effectiveness, and efficiency. Customer service contains these 2 measures. Effectiveness contains one of the OALCF measures, which is progress. And the data that gets plugged into EOIS CAMS is used to measure providers on these things. And we can get monthly reports out to show how we're doing on these measures based on the data that gets input into CAMS. And it also gives us an overall score every month on how we're doing. And meeting these measures and the overall score is basically what keeps the ministry happy and keeps our money flowing. Not meeting them results in sometimes your ETC requesting an action plan to address an area of deficiency, or if it's a little more severe, it might result in a directed improvement letter, which is a more in-depth action plan to address a particular deficiency. So the one that really, and the only one right now that relates to the OALCF is the progress measure under effectiveness. So there it was. And now I've just zoned in on effectiveness. Progress measure is the % of your learners who successfully complete at least one milestone. Keyword being successfully. If they don't attain it, it doesn't count. But you only need one measure, one successfully completed milestone to get the ticky box and the progress measure counted. The ministry expects us to do several milestones depending on how many, how long the learner's in the program, because the thought, and again, we could argue it back and forth, the ministry's thought is that completing milestones shows a progression of learning. We have other ways in our college delivery of showing the progression of learning. Completing milestones is the ministry's way of having us document progression of learning, relevant or not. Also, always important to remember the second point. When you have carryover learners, so those who are in the program March 31st who carry over to the new fiscal year on April 1st, it's like, okay, everything goes back to 0. And before those learners exit, you got to get them to do another milestone in the new fiscal year if you want to continue to have them count toward the progress measure. So some of you that have been around a while will know that we often refer to April as milestone month, because we want to make sure we get a new milestone in for students who might be leaving early in the fiscal year. Like maybe they're going to be finishing up in April or May. So we want to make sure that we give them a new milestone and that they, of course, hopefully successfully attain it so that they can count toward the progress measure before they're exited in the new fiscal year. So Therese has a question. If a student completes at least one milestone but doesn't attain another, should one still enter the unattained milestone, or does that negatively affect the DSQ 64? It doesn't negatively affect your measure as long as you have that one completed successfully. So you don't lose points in the DSQ measures for unattained milestones, but you only get credit for one attained milestone.
Okay. Okay, thanks. That was good because I wasn't sure, like all our students take a milestone in each course, and sometimes, they'll attain one but not another. So I don't know whether it's worth the exercise to enter in the unattained ones. Is it like,
Well,
I think Tina asked the same thing. Do the extra milestones show up anywhere else?
Well, they show up on the learner plan, and that's what the ministry wants to see. So yes, there's value in recording the milestones that are done, because when you have a file audit and the ministry pulls out a file and looks at the learner plan, they're going to expect to see a progression of milestones, attained or unattained.
Okay, great.
Most of us have adopted the approach of attaching one, possibly two milestones to each of our courses, and maybe having the students do one earlier in the course, having them do one later in the course. But even though there's not intrinsic benefit to us or the students in completing and recording the milestones, it is an expectation of the ministry that they will do more than one, and that those milestones will be recorded in the learner plan, and that will, in the ministry's mind, show some consecutive progress.
Thank you.
I try hard not to editorialize too much in my presentations, but I completely understand the challenges around milestones and always have. Oops, hang on here. So just looking back here in the chat. So is it Tina? Yeah, Tina was asking the same thing. Should they be completed? Does it show up anywhere? So in milestones show up on the learner plan. They show up on the big case activity report, but again, you don't get penalized for the unattained ones. You get credit for the one that is attained. Okay, and we're getting
Barb?
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
It's Tina. So even if they have several attained milestones, it's still not giving us any extra data or any extra credit to the learner. It's just extra work.
Yeah, you could view it like that. It's extra work that the ministry expects us to do, because they want to see the milestones as an indicator of progress. No matter how much we might think it doesn't really indicate progress, we're expected to provide a set of milestones, whether it's 2 or 10, throughout the course of the learner's journey with us.
Right. Well, and we're all compliant, but
Yes,
I can see this being more beneficial for community-based programs than it is for colleges.
Yeah. And to use the small letter definition of milestones, our tracking cards are full of milestones, as in things that the students achieve and demonstrate progress. Our assignments, our tests, our group activities, presentations, all the things that our students do show progress. But because there are so many different LBS providers, the only thing the ministry will use to look at progress is milestones, because every LBS provider is required to use them with their students to make that standard approach. But I completely agree with you, Tina. For us, it doesn't really show progress in the way as academic deliverers, the way we think of it showing progress.
Barb, it's Shelley.
Hi, Shelley.
Question about you made the statement that they expect at least 2 milestones. Is that actually in the guidelines?
No, I didn't say that they expect at least 2. They expect more than 1.
Okay. All right. Because I get that you only need to do 1. We've never been called on it. A lot of our files do have more than 1, but there's also a pocket that will only have 1, depending on the duration of the time with us. But I find it interesting too that they want to see progression, but the milestones do not have to be from the same competencies. So, you could be level 1 in numeracy, and then your second milestone be underfed and used information, and that's somehow showing progress, even if you're still at level 1.
Yep.
Just seems a little bit
I know.
off-sided to me.
I know.
Sorry, I know you're not the messenger. It's just,
Yeah.
yeah, it hurts my brain.
I know. And as
My-
someone who sat at the ministry's table back in 2008 to 2012, as all this was being developed, I can tell you that we raised many of these issues at the time, but this is what ended up happening anyway. And certainly if it's a short duration, if you're doing some targeted training and it's only say 4 weeks long or 2 weeks long, then you might only have one milestone. But, you know, and some ETCs might not question that. But if there is some length of time to the duration that the student's there with you, then I think it would be hard to justify why there would only be one milestone in the learner plan if your ETC questioned you on that. Judy raised a question in the chat. So Shelley and Tina, hopefully that covers a little bit of the discussion. Again, knowing that this is, the milestone piece is very challenging.
May I add a comment, Barb? It's Tina. So I've discovered that it's a lot easier to make the milestones work for you. There's a couple of them that are very generic. So you can choose, you know, if somebody has to do a report or whatever project they need to hand in for a certain course, use that milestone. They're not doing work twice.
Yes. I think that's a really good observation. And I can think of a couple like that, for example, where the teacher is actually finding the document to use for the milestone. And so therefore, if you're, you know, if I can't remember offhand which there, but I know totally what you're saying, Tina. You can sometimes make a milestone work for you because the nature of the milestone allows you to do something that's already within your curriculum and on your list of things the learner has to complete for your course. Yeah,
that's correct. I think 7 and 14 are very, very generic that you can tailor the assignment to it.
Right. And here's some great little info in the chat where people are actually agreeing with you, Tina, and itemizing some of those milestones. 14, 55, 7, 14, 26, 7, 35. I feel like bingo. M, 35. So
Barb,
yes,
it's
that's a
Val.
really good approach.
Barb, it's Val. I just have a quick question, and I don't know if this is kind of a sneaky way of doing things, but if you have an essay in the assessment, could we count that as a milestone?
Well, I suppose if there, you know, I'm not as familiar anymore with the exact milestones, but if there's a milestone that requires an essay, then you could have a twofer.
Yeah, but I think I can't remember which the number is, but yeah, there is one that you do have to write an essay for, and I can't remember which one it is, but.
And I'm sure there's one, and again, you guys would know better than me because I haven't been using them a lot lately, that requires you to pick a reading for the student to do. So if they're already reading something for you that's appropriate, then you could use it for the milestone as well. And that's a good example, as Tina said, of making the milestones work for us a little bit. Judy raised a question in the chat. Sometimes the progress is low on the report, but we know that students have completed the milestone. Do we know if there are any milestones that don't count? They all count. They all count. So if you know people are completing them and you're feeling the number on your report is low, Judy, I'm going to suggest it's something more to do with how or when they're being entered. Like you might have to backtrack through with your CAMS data entry people and do a bit of analysis around that, which is a little time consuming, but you know, hopefully you do want them to count.
Barb, it's Shelley. I just wanted to share, I know people have already said milestone 14. That's one that we have used as well, particularly last April when we started in the new fiscal and needed that first milestone. It's a really great way to send out something to your learners, especially in this format. We just picked like a couple of TED Talks and then formulated some questions that were around that and had the learner pick their TED Talk, pick their set of questions, and then they provided a response. And it was all about relevant to the pandemic and learning in the pandemic. So I thought it was a really fitting way to use it and to also get our milestones at the same time. So just thought I'd share that.
Nice, Shelley. Thanks for sharing that. Yep. 14 is a good one Again, another bit of a more generic one. And I just, before we kind of leave the topic of administering milestones, I just wanted to reiterate that, you know, while most colleges have attached 1, possibly 2 milestones to all of their courses, we did cooperate a little bit as a college sector years ago. And I think I don't know, maybe I did that mapping and said, for, you know, for ACE communications, here's a few of the milestones that might be the best fit. For ACE Tech Math, here's a couple of milestones that might be the best fit. Because I remember the CSC did share that kind of a document many years ago, which doesn't mean that people had to abide by that, but it was just to try to give people a bit of a head start on which milestones might fit with which courses. The advantage of having, you know, doing a milestone near the beginning of the course is if they drop the course and disappear, at least you got the milestone. Most of us now do milestones in orientation though, which is of course a great way to capture the first one. Shelley's saying, would love to see that document if it still exists. I will look for it, Shelley. I'll dig back into my big bag of memory sticks and USBs and see if I can find it there. Okay, so we're at 4:10. I'm happy to keep going. Just a couple more slides to finish off our progress or our performance measure discussion. If you have seen the report 64, the detailed service quality, you'll recognize this as a page out of it. And so this is the monthly report that comes out and that tells us where we're doing on that list of 6 or so performance measures that I had up on the screen earlier. And near the bottom is where our progress measure shows up, the % of learners who successfully complete at least 1 milestone. And the ministry expects, you know, their target for performance for this measure is that 60% of students will successfully complete 1 milestone. I'm sure most of you have much higher values than 60%. In this particular DSQ, the actual measure was 75%. Because at this particular moment in time, in this particular year, 1,424 of the 1,892 students registered had completed a milestone, which equated to 75%. So that's where the rubber hits the road. And the ministry uses this report, and the ministry expects us to use this report. It's 4 pages long. So again, I've just zoned in on the progress piece here. That's where it comes out. And again, doesn't matter if they have 5 that are not attained, as long as they have 1 that is attained during that fiscal year. Fiscal year is April 1st to March 31st. Carryovers need a new milestone successfully attained to count toward this measure in the new fiscal year. Leah's saying we also use 36 as a bio and chem assignment. Yeah, I've heard that one too. I think that might have been an oldie but goodie, using 36 in biology and chemistry. Allison's asking, is there a report that will tell us which specific learners need a milestone in the current fiscal or the date of a student's last milestone? Case activity report 61 is a beast because it's a massive Excel sheet, but it contains some information about milestones, but it's not going to do what you ask it to do. The inactive report is a useful way sometimes of identifying students who haven't done a milestone recently, because the inactive report shows someone that hasn't had any activity in their CAMS file within 60 days. And often the reason they haven't had any activity is because nobody has added a learning activity or a milestone for them. So the inactive list, which you can get out of the CAMS reporting site, is sometimes a way to help, but there isn't really a list, Allison, that just says this is the last time so-and-so did a milestone. And that's, yes, exactly, Allison. Using the inactive list doesn't in any way just refer to milestones. Shelley's mentioning, yeah, that's a good point, Shelley. If you look at the competency client in the case activity report 61, I am going to do some more discussions in the next couple of months about the reporting side, and we'll be able to delve a little bit more deeply into some of these questions around where we can, what the reports show us. And I'm just going to go back here for a sec. Report 61 especially would be a great one to analyze together. This is the last page, second last page of the report 64. And so again, I had listed these particular measures that we're currently accountable for earlier in the, excuse me, earlier in the workshop. This score, 7.41, is what's called the service quality standard. And so when all the different measures and the data from CAMS are pulled out, it ends up giving us a monthly score on where we're at. The minimum score the ministry expects is 6. That's the target. And then there's some math around how the measures get translated into these particular decimal numbers. And again, we could take the time to do it, but most importantly, it's understanding that doing milestones does contribute to your site's measures and your requirements to the ministry. At some point in the future, they might add back in the completion measures that used to be in the performance management framework originally. We used to get measured on learning activities, culminating tasks as well. But in 2013-14, after 2 years of CAMS, they pulled these measures out of things that count, because they realized, the ministry realized that they weren't getting good data around this. So if I go back one slide here to just kind of wrap up, your site's DSQ will show these measures of completion, but these don't count toward your performance measures, even though they're recorded here. These are the ones that count. These are the ones that used to count and may again in the future, or maybe they're, the ministry struggles with how to measure completions, especially in a program as diverse as LBS across all this community-based school board, college sectors, all the cultural streams. So I applaud them for pulling these out of the things that were measured on a couple of, back in 2013-14, because they really were not terribly valid measures. Milestones are not terribly valid measures, but they are what they are and we have to use them. I really hope in the future, if the ministry decides to measure us on some form of completions, that they revisit these in a meaningful way so that the completion measures perhaps could be meaningful. Okay, a couple people have to leave, that's fine. Just checking the chat again. So we've covered it all. That's our Coles Notes version. As I said, normally we would probably take about a half a day on this. We'll spend a little more time on reports in some other sessions. If you have any ideas for follow-up sessions that, Robin and I are planning our PD for the April, May, June time. And I won't do any more sessions in March other than our next virtual services meeting, which will be March 24th, not the 17th. I'm going to send out a message about that. Thanks for sticking with me today and slogging through what is sometimes sort of heavy and challenging material. Really appreciated your questions, your comments, your thoughts. We know the OALCF is challenging to work under. We don't do it for our colleges, we do it for the ministry. And we do it to help our learner mobility if they do move back and forth from one program to another. So I think I'll stop there. If you have any other ideas, feel free to put them in the chat and or jump in with any comments as we just wrap up today. And you're very welcome. I'm glad it was a good refresher. Lots of people are mentioning that. So have a great rest of the day. Keep the ideas coming, keep the questions coming. Always happy to receive your questions by email, and sometimes one person's question works into a whole workshop. Go feed the cat, yeah. I'll do that, Leah.
Yeah, my dogs are sitting here looking at me going, hello.
Yep. Yeah.
4:20, you got 9 minutes, lady, get that food out there.
Exactly. Yes, I love when you say that. Stay negative. I think that's a great way to end the session.
Stay negative.
Yeah, I like that. I stole that, T, and I put it on a couple of my own emails.
Thank you.
Good, I'm glad, Barb. It's fun. Good night, everybody.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
See you.